So hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Billy Humphreys and I am the Senior Marketing Manager here at MRL Consulting Group. For anybody that doesn't know, MRL is the market-leading recruitment consultancy focusing on semiconductors, automotive, software infrastructure, medical devices and finance. So today's webinar is all about how to build sustainability, a diverse roadmap which is beyond unconscious bias. So why have we created today's webinar? So today's been created to advance the dialogue surrounding the current issues across the globe around race and gender inclusion. So with the Black Lives Matter movement across the globe over the past few months, we felt this would be the perfect opportunity to educate our clients and our customers about things that they can do within their own business to make a positive change, but not only about race, but also about gender. Now, I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, who is Margaret Ochieng, who is the founder and the director of the Inclusive Village. Now, today's webinar is broken up into two different sections. So halfway through, we will stop for a short Q&A. And then after that, there'll be a webinar. We'll do a Q&A at the very end. So right now, I can pass straight over to Margaret, and I hope you enjoy today's session. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. I am delighted to facilitate today's session. I am an organizational psychologist by background, so I specialize in helping organizations to build inclusive and conscious workplaces that attract, retain, and develop the best and most diverse talent. And so that's why I'm here today. So to be able to attract, retain, and develop diverse talent, we need to be looking at a wide range of talent and where that talent might be found and how we might bring them on board. And that's why we have this webinar today. I will be focusing on just understanding really what is diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And these are terms that for many people on this call today, there will not be new terms. There'll be things that we know and that we understand. So I'll just give an overview of where I am coming from with this. We'll also see some popular topics: unconscious bias, inclusive recruitment, and some of the things that people already know and do, and where those things fall when we're thinking about building a lasting and sustainable diversity and inclusion program or setup or environment in our organization. So this is something overall I'm looking at: how can we win with an inclusive and diverse culture? So let's start by seeing our understanding of inclusion, diversity, and belonging. Most people commonly use this phrase by Ivana Myers. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And although when Ivana Myers used this phrase, she didn't mean for it to be analyzed or to be overthought about. But our understanding has somewhat been stuck on this particular definition. And now today I want to start by just redefining or expanding this definition of diversity and inclusion to help us see what else we can do with it. What is a more wholesome way of looking at this concept? And I'll stick with the same analogy. I'll stick with the same metaphor. So think about the party and the dance, for example. If we just stay on that same slide, think about the party. If we're talking diversity, then diversity is not being invited to the party. Because if you're being invited to the party, it means that you are a passive part of this process. Diversity, therefore, if we look at it correctly, would be knowing what the parties in your area are, who's going, who's inviting people. Inclusion would be being a part of the team that invites, that organizes, that runs the parties. Belonging would be perhaps staying afterwards to hear the gossip of who had a wardrobe malfunction, or who get crashed to the party, or where the next party would be, and having that debrief with the organizing committee and planning the next party, or looking at how best can we have more and more wonderful parties. So diversity and inclusion are not things that minority groups are standing from the outside and observing. When we have to do this properly, the minorities are a real part of the process. So whenever you see this definition, I want you to think about what would it mean for diversity. It means that opportunities in an organization are available and accessible to all. It means that inclusion means that voices are valued, people's differences are valued and are accepted and not questioned or judged. That people are able to come and contribute and be a part of that conversation. People truly feel that they belong in that space. And this is what I talk about when I talk about the village model. It's a workplace where everybody's voice is valued, where although we are allowed to have silos and our little teams or groupings where we feel we have a higher sense of belonging or friendships, that we don't make these systems rigid so we don't come in and out of them, but we make them porous enough so that we can come in and out and contribute to what is the bigger picture, the collective agenda, the bigger strategy that the organization or the team are trying to achieve. When we function this way, we identify and recognize our own individuality, but we also celebrate and recognize the individuality and contributions of everybody else around us. And when we do this, humanity and talent flourishes. So that, in a nutshell, is how I want us to think about these concepts. Now that we have looked at that, why is this important? Because the last few years, or the last several years, have led us to really understand that when people feel included in the workplace, these are the feelings and some of the words that are associated with inclusion, that people feel trusted. My work is seen as credible. When I'm feeling trusted, I feel like my work in this space, in my team, in the organization, is seen as credible and is therefore not overly scrutinized or overly questioned. I feel valued, which means I feel that I matter and my voice and opinions and contributions matter to this organization and to the bigger picture of what we are trying to achieve. Authentic, that I am able to be who I am while doing the things that I want to do in this organization, that I can contribute as my real self, that my failures and successes will not be attributed to some characteristic or protected characteristics, for example, that I bring. I am an individual. I can stand as I am. I can speak as I am. That I feel safe to learn. When people feel included, when people feel they belong, they feel safe to learn. And what does that mean? That means that when we make mistakes, the mistakes are not attributed to a stereotype or a collective identity that we belong to. We are treated as individuals. And therefore, if I make a mistake, then it will be accepted as a mistake that I have made, which I can learn from. And if I know that a mistake will not tarnish the rest of my career, I am able to step up and approach every opportunity as a learning opportunity. And that also increases people's ability to take interpersonal risk. So that you know that if I have something to contribute, although I haven't seen anybody contribute something similar in the organization, I know that I will not be judged negatively for it. I know that I can share my thoughts, my opinions, my creativity in a unique way. I can take that risk to put my voice out without fearing some sort of a backlash or this marking me for the rest of my career if it goes wrong. And when we say that diversity and inclusion are linked to creativity, it's these things that then free people into that creative space, into that higher performance space. It means that when employees sit around the table with their unique ideas, that no good ideas leave the table. Where people are willing to learn and be authentic, they will contribute every idea they have put on the table. Non-diverse, non-inclusive spaces what tends to happen is that people withhold a lot inside. While you're trying not to show your real self, you end up hiding both the good things that would empower your team, that would make your team have a bigger impact. You hide those things. So you hide what you think you're afraid of being judged on, but you also hide the contribution that you could make because you don't feel safe to learn or take that risk. So if you don't want your people to be leaving the table with wonderful ideas, you really would be looking at creating a more inclusive and safe space. Now, sometimes some organizations might get this wrong. So what does it look like? What happens when we get inclusion, diversity, and belonging wrong? When organizations get this wrong, their competitors win. So you will see that we know that more diverse workplaces perform better in business and have better outcomes. So you could be losing. You're losing on the best talent because they might prefer your competitors to yourself. We are seeing increasing amounts of litigation. There's a lot of filming happening now than before. So if we don't make the effort to really learn what does inclusion mean and how can I be a safer and more empowering space? How can I challenge my biases and misconceptions at work? Then you stand a risk of yourself or your company or somebody in your team being sued for saying or for doing something that is wrong, but which they don't think is wrong. There's something around brand reputation, and just Google in the news, you will see in the last year we've had companies having to fight loads of different brand damaging issues, for example. So if you don't get this right, your brand could end up out there with a problem that you now have to resolve, that you now have to allocate resources to. So we've had where people have discriminated against people and then they've been taken to court. For example, we know the recent case of Amy or Karen Cooper. That was a personal loss, but then her company had to step in very quickly to disown her to manage the reputation of the brand. So these things are things that are live, and we're just going to continue to see more and more of them. And with a bad brand reputation, we also have a risk of revenue loss. And the risk of revenue loss extends beyond just the brand. We do know we have customers who've come to us who will say that we went to bid for a project, but we didn't win it because the client threw us out because we did not present a diverse team. So companies are starting to really take this issue seriously, because if diversity is linked to higher and better performance, and if you're coming to bid for business and you're bringing a homogeneous team, everyone looks the same, everyone sounds the same, I might see that as a lack of creativity and therefore a reduced value in what you are going to offer me. And so think about your revenue, think about how much more business you would win and how much more appealing you would be to your wider stakeholders, to your customers, to the people that you're trying to do business with. It's all about your brand as well. It's about revenue, but it's also about being ethical and being a good place to work. We know that when we get it right, there's a piece of research by Catalyst that shows that when we get inclusion right, 49% of people in our teams will report better problem-solving abilities, that there's higher work engagement, that we have higher retention rates, and we are more likely, again, it goes without saying that diversity has been systematically linked to higher innovation and higher creativity. And all these things add up to better business outcomes and a much better environment, because inclusive environments are not just good for minority groups. Inclusive environments are good for everyone. So this shows that there's not just a business and commercial case for improving diversity and inclusion in our organizations. There is also an ethical case. There is also a legal case. There is also a genuine need, a pressing issue of our time that needs to be addressed and resolved. And we have seen massive leaps with many organizations stepping up to say the time is now, we want to do something. So if it's that simple, then why don't we get it right? What are still some of the current challenges? When we don't get it right, what is happening? When we don't get it right, it's because often we still have diversity and inclusion efforts that are not aligned or linked with business strategy. So it's seen as something that is nice to have, but not something that is a must-have. So you have your strategic agenda, something that the big picture that you're trying to deliver, but you're not looking at the diversity of your talent or your people as one way in which you could deliver your business strategy. That is one big challenge that is slowing down efforts. And then in many organizations, diversity and inclusion is still seen as the problem of HR or diversity and inclusion department. Sometimes we don't even have a diversity and inclusion department. So it's not seen as everyone's problem in the organization. It's probably seen as the problem of leadership, and at worst, is seen as the problem of the minority group. So whether it's women or racial minorities or people with disability in the workplace, if somebody is going to talk about diversity or address it, they are the ones who should do it. That's one of the challenges that is slowing progress down. Then many organizations still see this just as a compliance issue. So the bit where I am just trying to not be sued. So it's all contained in your policies. It's all contained in all the legal things, and you're just doing the bare minimum to not get sued, but not threading, not looking at this as something that could actually help your business perform better in all areas. There is also something around the lack of visionary leadership. We know that where there is visionary leadership, leaders think about outside the box. People think about what are we doing currently and what are we not doing? What have we not tried? And looking at your people and thinking, actually, I only have a certain type of talent in here. What's missing? Who's missing around the table? Who could bring me the ideas that will take me to the next level? And then sometimes when we tackle diversity and inclusion, we're thinking in terms of exercises. So I'll bring this training, or I'll hire those number of people there, and I'll tick a box in my head and say, I have done it. So tick box exercises undermine the real spirit of diversity and inclusion. Diversity, as I will say over and over again during this webinar, is not a destination that you arrive at. So anytime you think, I have done that and I have done that and therefore I have done it, that's backing up the wrong tree, really. It's a journey. It's a journey. So it's something that evolves, that develops. You never really arrive at it. There's always room for growth and improvement. And then there's the performative piece, which we have seen a lot in the recent weeks, where people are putting out statements or really acknowledging that there is a lack of diversity and that this is wrong and we should do something about it. They might respond with tokenistic gestures, but they're unwilling, the business is unwilling to put time, resources, and the learning required to achieve better outcomes. And that's why we have this photograph here, which I wanted to highlight. So Christine Lagarde, who is the president of the European Central Bank, tweeted this photo soon after she took her role last year. And as you can see in this picture, there are a few women in the room. So as you can see, Christine is at the back. She's wearing a black, a navy turtleneck. Everyone else in the room looks quite similar. And I would not be surprised if they are from a similar background. And I bet you they've never probably thought about the fact that they all look quite similar. It probably has never crossed their minds, because in their defense, they might say, we have diversity of thought. I'm sure you have heard about people talking about diversity of thought. So if you ask this group of people, they might say, no, we're very diverse because we have diversity of thought. That stands to be questioned. How much diversity of thought can there be among people who probably share very similar background and demographically are quite similar? But you can see there are a few women in the room. If you look at them, they're on the wall. They're stuck on the wall, and they're also from the olden days. So somebody's made sure that they're not going to come off those walls to speak to us. And these are what we call performative acts. When people are able to do things that signal that they appreciate diversity or that they recognize diversity, but are not willing to commit to the learning, to commit to the process, to commit to the change that is required. So, and I think the reason that Christine tweeted this photo without actually saying anything very much was to provoke the world to think about these kind of settings that are not uncommon in many organizations. And also, lastly, that many organizations think that diversity and culture are separate things. So either they don't think about the organization culture, or they don't think about the link between inclusion, diversity, and the overall culture, the way it feels to belong to this organization, the way it feels to do business with this organization. So those are some of the challenges that we currently face. Now, apart of that, I wanted to talk about unconscious bias. So one of the most popular things when we're talking about ticking up boxes is unconscious bias. Those of us who are consultants in this space will recognize that when clients come to us looking at, okay, fine, I finally want to do something, I am ready. Would you like to come and run some unconscious bias training? It's often the first thing that people ask for. And that is not necessarily wrong in itself, because unconscious bias, these are programs that are designed to expose people's unconscious ways of thinking or patterns of thinking. They are meant to eliminate discriminatory components of our unconscious behaviors. And when these trainings are undertaken in the workplace, really they're meant for awareness. And that is a good thing. That's not a bad thing. Except what tends to happen, research shows that often when people have gone through unconscious bias training in organizations that are not diverse or inclusive, where the culture does not support inclusion, where the strategy does not support inclusion, is that people will leave the training and they'll tick a box in their mind and say, I have done unconscious bias training, therefore I cannot be racist, or I cannot be sexist. I am therefore inclusive because I have done this training. So rushing to the checkbox. And this is why we have to be very careful with this training or any other forms of training that we bring in the workplace, that we do not implement things that are going to allow people to check a box in their minds and say, I have done it. But to let people take that journey of change, knowing that we're not going to a particular place, we are on a learning and development journey that will take us in so many different ways, but with it, we will improve and put systems and structures in place. We will learn, we will be challenged, we will challenge along the process. So this is one of the things, this is one of the challenges I'd like to throw out of why sometimes people will just say they have done something. So we've done so many unconscious bias training, but nothing has changed. It's because all you are trying to do is raise an awareness on the issues that there is bias in the workplace, and then you stopped there. So this is why we talk about beyond unconscious bias, what needs to happen. So if you are going to roll out unconscious bias training, these are some of the things that you should be thinking about. It's recommended that you debrief and measure the impact of the training that you have offered. It's also recommended that you use homogeneous teams. So for example, a team that are going to interview people, and they can go through this training, and while it's still fresh in their minds, if they then go into that recruitment exercise, they are more likely to be aware of their biases and therefore be able to check. Well, if this goes a few weeks after, we know that they're likely to forget and therefore regress and go back to old patterns. Not everybody does. The majority of people who then undergo this training regress to old patterns after a period of time. That if you are going to be offered unconscious bias training in the workplace, make sure that there is some background on what is it and how does it work in the background, and some theory attached to it, and it's just not implicit association test that tells you you've got bias, you have got this much bias. Okay, then you repeat it and say, I have reduced the amount of bias I have, therefore I am safe. So we're trying to avoid checkbox systems. We're trying to avoid interventions that then don't lead to behavior change. And so it's not wrong to use unconscious bias, but you have to be careful. How has that training been? What is the content? What are the aims? How far does it go? Even when it comes to just creating awareness, is that awareness well defined, applied to the individual, applied to the organization? How am I going to measure impact, and what am I going to do after I have told people that they have unconscious bias? Most people will throw their arms in the air and say, it's unconscious, I cannot control it, therefore it has nothing to do with me. It then means that there is deferring of the responsibility for change to something else or to someone else. So I just wanted to highlight that we need to move beyond typical unconscious bias training to try and build I'll talk about this later, but something that is more lasting and more sustainable, that is linked to the business strategy and linked to our overall organizational culture. Something else we do, some other things we do, there are many practices, especially for those who work in recruitment, that you will recognize. So, for example, gender neutral advertising, or people have been asking me recently if there's such a thing as race neutral advertising, as we'll see on the next slide. So MRL, who are hosting us today, have done this work, and I wanted to just use these as some of the examples. So we know, for example, that when candidates read job adverts, if words such as hungry for are used, then more men tend to apply. If words such as trusting are used, women tend to apply. Words such as crazy attract more men. And this is after many adverts had been analyzed to see how these are attracting or repelling certain types of candidates. Words such as transparency and inclusive attracted more women. When we used words such as killer or cutthroat, less women applied. I want to explain the science behind this so that when people are doing job adverts and trying to make them diversity neutral, that they know what is happening behind those adverts. So what is happening behind those adverts? When we read a job advert, or when we visit a company website, or when we are sitting at the lobby of a certain organization, or when we are interacting with a customer, or when we are listening on the phone, or when we are on a webinar like this, our minds are constantly doing something we call signaling. That's something that is showing us, what does this mean? What does this mean to me? So, for example, in job adverts, we have language cues. So words such as crazy or killer, for example, for women, there's a stereotype that make that kind of language more stereotypically male. And so men might think, oh, a killer environment, or a highly competitive or cutthroat environment. Men might feel, without actually thinking about it, subconsciously feel, oh, that I would belong in that space. So there is a belonging cue. There are more, maybe people in that team are more like me. Whereas women will feel the cue there, although it's conveyed through language, there would be a belonging cue that most people in this team might be male, therefore of a certain type, and therefore I might not have a sense of belonging, and so therefore I will not apply. So there are words that carry certain stereotypes. When people read those words on job adverts or on company websites, or when people are sitting at the lobby of a certain organization waiting to speak to somebody, or when a customer walks through at the door, they are scanning the environment for the cues that are there. Those cues are attached to certain stereotypes that are implanted at the back of our minds. Now, those cues will tell us, if you're a candidate choosing to go into an organization, those cues will tell you whether you're going to belong there or whether you are not going to belong there. Those cues signal a sense of belonging. They signal stereotypes that can encourage you to be drawn to that organization or to be repelled by it. Now, this same signaling system happens through an onboarding process. It happens when we're thinking about retention. When people decide to leave, it's because there's been a lot of signaling sometimes in the language, in the practices of our colleagues, in the behaviors that we see, and sometimes in the things that are happening quite overtly to show us that we do not belong here, or that we are being stereotyped as this and not that, and therefore we are unlikely to do well. So if we are designing people processes, we need to be aware of what are we signaling, what stereotypes might be attached to the words that we are putting out. When candidates go to our website, what are we signaling? Are we signaling that this is the kind of workplace where they could belong, or not at all? When racial minorities visit your website and see the team is an all-white team, you have photographs of minority groups, but when they're looking at the team's page, then it's all the same people, then the candidate might have to weigh, it depends on how desperate they are as well, or how much they want to work for you. But from the word go, you are signaling to candidates that they might not belong, that people like them are either not welcome or people like them don't do well. Now, this concept is what we are applying when we're saying diverse interview panels. We're trying to signal to the candidate that people like you are welcome, people like you belong, people like you have a voice, people like you have the power to choose who joins the team. That is the same principle behind diverse panels that we use. So I just wanted to put that out there. It's also in terms of when we're choosing to develop people, when a candidate comes into the organization and sees senior leadership is all probably white and male or all female, what is the cue there? The cue there is, depending on who that candidate is and how many characteristics they share with that senior team, they might start to have doubts as to whether, is this a place where I will thrive? If my ambition is to get to senior leadership team, will I make it here? And so you are constantly signaling to candidates, you're constantly signaling to your employees, you're constantly signaling to your customers the kind of culture or the kind of place that you are. And so being aware of how you're signaling and changing those demographics, changing the messages you're putting across, changing just what your website looks like, and really working on truly depicting the images, or depicting the adverts, or depicting the spirit and letter that you put out with your brand is really important. Because if you're putting one thing out and then candidates are seeing another thing when they come into the organization, it again signals you're not a genuine place where they might want to come and work. So these are some of the things that we could be thinking about and promoting if we are going to create a truly inclusive and diverse workplace. Now, I am going to pause for a moment, and we will take a couple of questions.
So if I look at the questions, we've got two questions that stand out. So the first one is, how can you measure impact of unconscious bias training?
Great. So as we said, the most common tool that is used for unconscious bias is the implicit association test. Some of these tests are online, they are free. So if someone takes that test at the beginning, does unconscious bias training, and does another test after that, and their scores have improved, that's one way to say, okay, we have seen an improvement, there is some impact. Or some people just don't use the implicit association test, but they use exercises that single out implicit association. So they might give you one set of exercises where you try to see how well you score. And then they do their training, and then they give you another set of exercises that you haven't seen before. And they can weight the two things to see, okay, how much have I improved? Now, the question is how long you can sustain that improvement if you were to be tested the fourth and the fifth time, and 6 months later and a year later, is the question that everyone has about unconscious bias training. Most people will just evaluate it as overall training, so maybe happy sheets. Did you like this training? Did you find it useful? And the happy sheets are always really positive for unconscious bias training because they're interesting for people and people do find them helpful. But not necessarily that because they will change their behaviors or that they have learned the skills that they need to improve.
Brilliant. Okay, and we have another question from Emily that says, if we do not have a diverse company, how can we show that we welcome diverse candidates? Great question.
It is a great it's a great question. Where do I start when I haven't got diversity already? And we will talk about this later on when we talk about the roadmap. I think that the important question there is to ask, why do we not have a diverse workforce? Because the answer to that question then helps you understand, if I'm going to go out to attract a diverse workforce, what am I going to do? How do I do that? So you can always start. If you don't have a diverse workforce, you can always start. But your journey is very different from somebody who already have a diverse workforce at a certain level. So what you can do at that point is try to communicate genuinely. There's something about gaining that insight into who you are and then being honest and saying, we have noticed that we are not a diverse workforce. Therefore, we are embarking on a journey to improve the diversity of our workforce, and why. Being very genuine, authentic, and honest will help you to connect with your candidates, will help your candidates to see you as really trying to improve something. So if you're starting from zero, it's still good to start, but you're starting from a different point. The danger, what you could do that could be dangerous, is to then paste many faces of diverse people on your website, and then candidates come and then they don't see those faces. That would be perceived as dishonest. Being honest with how you look right now and how you are, and being able to understand why that is. Is it your recruitment processes? Is it your culture, your overall culture? Is it your retention and promotion? Is it your physical location of where you are? What is it that is causing the lack of diversity in your workplace? Are there just behaviors that are so deeply ingrained? Is it just that you have never thought about it? Is it a lack of visionary leadership that pays attention to the issue? When you answer those questions, then you will see your starting point. And this is why we're going to do that exercise about how do you start. It's important to start at the right place. That way you can make incremental progress.
And our final question for this part we have is from Peter, and it says, how do we create adverts that come across as all-inclusive, but also not just look like we're trying to hire a certain type of person to become more diverse?
Oh, that's a really good one, which is really challenging. That's like almost a section on its own. So if we look back to those three things that I am talking about, some adverts you will read and you will just feel, oh, that's something wrong with that advert. It just looks like the person is trying really hard and the person is probably not genuine. So as long as you know that in your job adverts, you're signaling to people that you are a good place to come and work, that you have an inclusive brand, or at least you have a desire to welcome everybody and allow them to contribute. Now, that is the thing I'm talking about, that watching the language that you're using. Does that language contain cues that different types of people will be accepted and will be given a fair chance to access your organization? Looking at how you signal belonging. How are you going to communicate to your candidates that really short advert that they will be able to belong in your workplace? Or are you putting some stereotypes, so using those sort of words that are associated with stereotypes. Another example I saw was an advert that says, we particularly want candidates from Ivy League universities, for example. Now, on the surface, that advert looks innocent, but you can almost see the problem with it, that some candidates might already try to picture. It's about the picture that the candidate is creating in their minds. Who are the people who are likely to go to an Ivy League university? They're probably predominantly from a certain socioeconomic background, are they more predominantly white? And so even though the candidate, a candidate from an ethnic minority background who has gone to the same university might still not choose you because they are thinking about, do I want to go and work in a place where I might struggle to belong because maybe the culture is controlled by a certain demographic that comes from a certain socioeconomic background who have accessed a certain type of education. So thinking through how you can make your advertising as neutral and as welcoming to a variety of people is the skill. It's not a skill that you can just develop overnight, but with practice and with looking for feedback on the adverts that you already have, passing this potentially through a professional eye to give you feedback, then you'll start to pick the patterns like, oh, when I say it like this is what it means. Also, if you have a diverse team creating these adverts, you stand a chance of creating better and better job adverts. But it doesn't end there because you're going to bring these people through an interview process. Now, you need to think about that interview process. At what point do you lose a certain demographic, for example? How far do the women go? And then looking at that particular tool and thinking, why does this tool lose our candidates? Or is it an onboarding, or do they just stay 6 months? So it's looking through the entire employee life journey. It's one thing to attract candidates, to bring them on board, but the journey that they're going to go through is even more important. Great, so let's move things slightly on. We've been talking about the culture that supports these practices that we are talking about. So we know that our people, our processes, and our systems all contribute to the culture that we have, the general feel that we have about an organization and the people that work there and the brand. Now, if we are to create lasting progress will be embedded in that culture. You cannot separate the two. But I've put across some of the things that can help us think about the things that we do and the journey that we are supposed to take to create that lasting progress. So for example, the first three things you see to the left: insights, motivation, and actions. I spoke about insights slightly earlier. I said that if you are starting this journey, in fact, it doesn't matter if you're starting, like today, if you're going to try and do something about diversity and inclusion, the first thing you want to think about, the first thing you want to make sure you're aware of are these insights. Insights are what's really happening in my organization with diversity and inclusion right now. Now, insights will help you to understand how bias or how your processes or how your people are currently positioned, are currently behaving or not behaving to contribute to the culture that you want to create. So thinking about your insight, I will talk about this in the next, but meanwhile, so insights here is just knowing, what do I know about this organization? So for example, somebody has asked earlier, what if we are not diverse to start with? That is an insight. The insight is we are not diverse. So that allows you to ask the next question. So where do I want to go? Now, once you understand where you are, your reality, and some sort of an aspiration of where you need to go, you need to build a motivation, because you can't achieve anything until you have a clear case of what you're trying to achieve. So when we're thinking motivation, we're thinking an engaging narrative for inclusion. If you've discovered that your organization is not diverse at all to start with, asking yourself why, that is the insight, and then saying, what can I do about this? That is the motivation piece. An engaging narrative that you can share with the people that make decisions and across the organization. To try and create the third thing, tangible actions that drive you closer to that lasting progress you're trying to create. Now, you're not going to be able to do these three things without certain competencies. So these are really tangible skills. So maybe you just don't know where to start, to which either you can hire somebody in the department with more expertise or work with an external consultant to build your competencies the competencies that you need to build the insight, the competencies that you need to think about your motivation, the competencies that you need to put clear actions in place. The other thing you need are behaviors that will support the entire process. Behaviors such as allyship, people who will be on board to support the progress, to contribute, flexibility and openness to experience something new, really good behaviors that are important for those who are starting on the journey of change, or those who have stalled somewhere in between but need to go again. So thinking, we're going to go through this more keenly. If we're going to create a roadmap, these are some of the components that we start with. We start with some insights. What do we know about the system right now? How does that then help us to build some motivation to start the journey? And then what actions do we put in place? Then you are interrogating, what competencies have we got to work with? Are our behaviors aligned to the change that we're trying to make? Okay, so let's look at this in a more detailed way on the next slide. So as you can see, on that first box to the left is insight. And as I have explained, this is about thinking about, what does diversity and inclusion mean to us in this organization right now? Where are we? Thinking about what is our current reality and what is the aspiration? A year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, what would be a good place to be in terms of our diversity and inclusion agenda? Now, how do you get your insight? What are some of the things that can help you build insight? So say, for example, up until today, nobody has spoken about diversity and inclusion in your organization. As a result, you're looking around and seeing you're not a visibly diverse place. And therefore, you're feeling, I have to do something. Okay, where would you start? You'd start to look at your data. For example, there's different sources of data in organizations. There's quantitative data. So for example, there are this number of this type of people here. So really explaining, if you're going to start with insight and start this conversation, looking at your organization and saying, there is only one woman in a senior leadership team of 15. Or there is not a single woman, or there is not a single person of color from middle management upwards, whereas there are many of them at junior level roles. That is an insight. So looking at quantitative data that probably already exists in your organization is a good way to start gaining that insight. Now, you can move beyond quantitative data. You should move beyond quantitative data to explore qualitative data. So for example, if there are a few minority groups in your organization, thinking about, if you're not part of the majority in this organization, what does that feel like? This is what we call the lived experience exercises or stories from minority groups that we know help us to understand barriers and enablers of diversity and inclusion, or of success in a certain organization. So exploring the lived experience of your employees, both the majority and the minority groups, will let you understand who is likely to succeed here. Who are we attracting, retaining, promoting, investing in? Who do we listen to and why? It gives you an insight to your culture, the way it's experienced within the organization. You can go further out and listen to some of your customers. How do they experience you? There are other places where you can get some data. So for example, artifacts, your publications, for example, your website, materials that you send out, all those things contain important data that explain what diversity and inclusion currently mean to you, what your reality is right now, and you start to think about what might my aspirations be. This is where we can then, if you already have some minority groups or you don't, this is where you could then do awareness training such as unconscious bias to try and start understanding or just even introduce the conversation, because we do know that in some organizations people don't even want to talk about this. So unconscious bias training is a good place to start a conversation in a really what I call a cold system. So these are some of the things. The affordances are things that you can use to try and trigger the system, to start asking the question, to start seeing the problem. Because if the organization is not diverse or is not diverse at certain levels, it means that perhaps nobody is asking the questions that need to be asked. Now you need to start by asking those questions. Is asking, what is diversity to us? What does it look like? What would it feel like? And with that, you then build your aspirations. So insights, it doesn't matter which part of this journey you are at, you will always need insights to move to the next level. Once you have got your insights, you now want to build some motivation around those insights. So we do know that identifying your best your starting point will determine how far you go on your diversity and inclusion journey. If you pick the wrong point to start, it is very difficult to build cumulatively to support your journey. So this is why I would say really think about the insights that you want to generate and then translating those insights all the way through. So once you've got your insights, you're going into the motivation space. This is where we use the insights that we have gained to articulate what is the business case, the moral case, the ethical case, the legal case for change. Here we need to make this urgent. We need to communicate the aspirations that we have developed in step 1. We need to engage with our stakeholders to hear their thoughts, their reflections, to take their questions. We need to think about who are the important people that would help this change happen. We need to think about the networks inside and outside the organization that will influence or encourage our thinking. This is where we formulate why this, why now, why us. And you can even take it to an individual level if you're the one leading this change and thinking, why me? Why do I want to lead this change? Why do I want to do it now? Why this and not something else? Or if you're thinking about different strands of diversity, so say, for example, you're in a gender diverse team or a gender diverse organization, but you're trying to think about racial diversity. This is the time when you really think, why do I care about racial diversity? It's educating yourself. What is the impact of this? What is the business case for improving racial diversity in this business? How can I communicate this case to senior management, to the leadership of this organization? How can I communicate it to myself? It's building a credible and strong case for what you are trying to do. Now, what are some of the things? If you look down there to affordances again, you can think about what allows me to do this. One is the insights I have gained about the business, the stories I have listened to. I have listened to some of the stories of my minority ethnic colleagues, for example, and I have realized that while every day we smile and work and hope that we are a good place to work, not everybody in this organization feels the same. There are people who are coming to work and feeling like they're going to battle, and that is not fair. And therefore, I will do something about this. Some of the things that can also help you, networks. So if you have employee networks, for example, if you don't have them, this is a good time to start creating them, gathering people around the case you're creating, saying, the insights show us that this is happening. Would you like to come on a committee that will help us do this? So building those networks if you don't have them. If you have them, sharing your insight to those networks and using that to almost catalyze and motivate those networks to take action. This is where you start to build commitment, asking people those same questions. Why this? Why now? Why you? Building a commitment of why they want to do it. Because the journey of diversity and inclusion is a journey. It's not a destination that we are going to. So without this motivation, without this personal and collective case, things do fall to the ground pretty quickly. Some other things we might need are resources. So now that we think this is a pressing issue, how much resource do we have? How much resource will I allocate to this? If you're in the senior leadership team, you have just had these insights that have shown you that while you thought you were leading a really good organization that is a great place to work, you have just heard about the experiences of some of your employees, and that has left you a bit shaken. Now you're thinking, I want to solve this. I want to solve this because it matters to me. I want to solve this because it matters to my business. And therefore, I am going to put the following resources to it. And you're thinking about, I don't probably have the skills and the competencies. We saw that in the previous slide. Therefore, I am going to get some support, some external support from a consultant or from an expert to try and help me work things out. Now that you're there, you have built your case, you have motivated the business, you have set things on fire. Comms teams are really important here because all these messages have to be communicated in a certain way for them to have the impact that they need to have. So working with your creatives at this point to try and get your message out, to not just leave it as something that's on the side. Remember, we said one of the challenges of diversity and inclusion is that it's treated as something that is outside the business strategy. Threading this motivation, threading these insights across all your people, processes, and systems so that it's communicated throughout the business is something else you need to be considering. So you're not just communicating, say, from HR to this group of people. It's something that needs to be an organization-wide, building that collective purpose around the journey that you're about to take as an organization. Now, if you manage to do that successfully, then you naturally see that you're now in a place where you can start to put some tangible actions in place. And now you are not alone. We did say one of the challenges that businesses have is that this is left to be the work of HR or diversity and inclusion teams. But if you really build this motivation piece, you will bring a lot of people. You'll bring the entire business with you. Every head of department, every section, procurement, insiders and outside of the organization will have bought in to the change that you're trying to make. Therefore, as an HR lead or as a diversity and inclusion lead or as the CEO of the organization, this whole thing is not left to sit on your shoulder alone because you can't. It takes everybody in the organization. You are trying to make diversity and inclusion problem everybody's problem. That's what we're doing in this step 2. Try and make it every single person's priority and a problem to be solved. That helps you then to go to step 3, where we then now are trying to create actions. So the actions are where we turn those aspirations that we built in step 1 into realities or goals. This is where we start to set targets. We want to see this number of people with these characteristics or this diverse number of people here and there. This is where you rejig your entire business strategy to include inclusion, so threading it into your business strategy or talent strategy. So it's not a standalone function. This is where we have tasks and timelines and KPIs. What do you measure you will do? So how are you going to measure when you say we want this number of people by this time? How are you going to measure that? And how are you going to communicate that? If you measure it, it will get done. This is where we say, what exactly will we do? Where will we do it? And how are we going to do it? So what are some of the things that can help you here? Again, the insights that you have built on step 1, the motivation that you were working on in step 2, visionary leadership that we talked about earlier as a key determinant of whether we go on this journey or not. Training and learning, this can go back. So if you saw that in step 1, you did some unconscious bias training, in step 2, you can do some talks, you can do some overall training to equip people with the competencies, to build, to thread inclusion into your processes and systems. In step 3, we're bringing in more training to actually try and deliver some of the actions that we need. So the training should offer people opportunities to learn. And you can target both minority and majority groups. What skills, what competencies do people need for us to achieve the overall goals that we have set for ourselves? That's what we're doing in step 3. So tangible actions, this is where we have timelines. This is where we have timelines at organizational level, which are then cascaded to team levels, to the granular parts of the organization. That's where it happens. And as we said, these things are being supported by behaviors and competencies that allow us to create that sustainability across the business, that allow us to see visible diversity within a certain period of time, that there are accountabilities, things will be measured, people will be challenged, questions will be asked. And in this process, by building that motivation, by bringing the entire business on the journey, we are building a sense of connectedness between people and processes that we are trying to create. So here we're talking about how we are impacting our culture and how that culture is supporting us. If one of the insights you had was that you just have a negative, probably adversely competitive and indifferent culture, then you are thinking about now, in terms of your actions, you're thinking there is some work that we need to do around our culture. If you have discovered that part of the problem is that the leadership is not committed and therefore they will not put resources to this, and their behaviors continue to be indifferent or even undermining the whole process of inclusion, then you're thinking, what kind of training, support, coaching can we do with our leaders to help them be a part of this journey? How do we communicate and motivate our leaders to join into the vision that we're trying to create? We're thinking about what we will reap, how we show people in terms of business performance, how we're going to measure those things, how we're going to see improvement, the stories we are going to tell both qualitatively and quantitatively on the journey. And again, as you can see, we continue to need more insight, more motivation, more learning, and more training, and making this an all-inclusive and joint-up process. Now that seemed like a lot of stuff, and it is. But you can break it down. You can break it down in timelines, and this is the work that the experts do, is that they can help you to break this down so it's not overwhelming. So don't look at it as one big thing. You can just take it one point at a time. And when you're building the insight, your organization, your stakeholders will already know that you're trying to do something about diversity and inclusion. So it's not about just the actions. You can thread some actions. So insights also have actions. What actions are there within your insight stage? And you're already trying to communicate this. People visibly know something is changing in the organization. When you're in the motivation space, there will be actions that you have to do to do that communication, to spread the word, to form those teams, to build those stakeholders. So there's already actions going on. So it's not that I'm waiting until I get to stage 3 for me to start developing actions. Actions are threaded all the way through, but those actions will be sort of more focused on my actions right now are to build the case for change in the business, or my actions right now are to build insight, or my actions right now are tangible, measurable, long-term impact that we're trying to create this year, next year, and the next year. Right. Okay. Now, let's look at a sample. A sample journey, what would that look like, for example? So I've created one. So I don't want to give you a template that you can just fill in, because as you can guess from what I'm saying, every organization is going to look very differently. Your starting point is going to be very different because it's going to be informed by the insights that you have gained. So we don't have just one thing that we have to do. This is driven by your insights. So this is just an example. Say, for example, my insights are that at junior levels, we're very diverse. We're also very gender diverse at all levels. There's very little awareness of biases in the organization, and also people are not willing to disclose to us their protected characteristics. So as a result, I have then gone and done some lived experience surveys and listening sessions. I have looked at some of our processes and artifacts like our website and how we are coming across, and I have done some awareness training that is productive. So that's step 1, and all those things will then have timelines, or these are the things that I then can do. Then you come, okay, now that I know that these are my insights, then when I come to motivation, I'll create a timeline for my step 2. That while I was doing all that listening across the business, I actually understood that people perceive this, both minority and majority groups largely perceive this place as a nice place to work, but that there is a lot of bias in our promotion processes or in our recruitment processes, that people in this organization actually have no inclusion competencies, have never thought about it, don't even know what it is. Okay, so some of the things I then can do, that I can then create activities around, how am I going to empower and use minority voices to showcase the talent that we have and the talent that we want to get? What are some of the trouble spots in this organization that I can target really quickly to create some quick wins? Who are the networks and allies that I need to tap into at this stage to try and help me move forward? And what is my role in this, say as the CEO or as the head of HR or as a senior leader leading a particular department? Now, having done all that, I'm thinking about, okay, some targets now. So I need a 50% increment in gender diversity or in racial diversity over the next 3 years. Okay, these are the actions that I'm going to take to help me do that. To enable me to do that, let me look at our policies, for example. What policies do we have? How are they supporting the agenda that we have? Thinking about your strategy at that point, does this align with the overall talent strategy or our overall people strategy or our overall business strategy? How do I link those things? Now, we know that now actions could happen in terms of departments. These are the actions at departmental levels. These are the actions at function levels. And these are the actions that we're going to undertake on our business strategy. And at the bottom, you can see throughout that process, you're thinking about, if I'm on the insight stage, what are some of the competencies that I need to build? Do I have them in-house? Do I need to get them externally? What behaviors am I seeing in the organization that is creating progress or undermining progress? What resources have I been given, or what resources do I have that I want to use for this role, for this job? And how does my overall culture, how does our overall culture support or undermine the things that we are doing? And what work can we do around that? And then you can see I have left the other bits, because then once you gain insights there, after every round, you get more insights so you can continue. And this is why we're saying it is a journey and not a destination. So here you'll be creating timelines. You'll be creating timelines at organizational level, at departmental levels, at team levels, making sure that this is threaded throughout your organization. You're not just looking inwardly, you're also looking outwardly. What kind of suppliers do you have? How are those decisions made? What is it in your processes that is making this difficult for some of your suppliers, for example, and what can you do about that? So different organizations will have different roadmaps. Those roadmaps will depend on where you want to start and where you want to go next. We did say that where you start can determine how far you go. Because what then might happen is you end up with so many disjointed activities and nothing aligned. It becomes very difficult to measure impact. And therefore, if you are able to align your work, to align all the activities that you're going to do at the beginning, then you will be able to measure impact, because you can just create the similar ways of measurements throughout the organization. Tracking and measuring is a key part of how far you can go in the process. Using your team, your creative teams, linking up with credible external stakeholders who understand not just the theory and practice, but also understand the science behind the research and the evidence behind the solutions that they're recommending for you is really important. And most of all, this has to be a priority for your leadership team. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Now, everybody can take something like that and make it personalized, make it contextualized, and start where their organization needs to start. And just finally, I was going to talk about some competencies that we need. So if you're the one in charge of this process, What are some of the things that you need? It does seem like a big task, but as I said, if you spread it across the organization, then you won't have that sense of you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. So, resilience. There will be times when you'll be challenged, misunderstood. You will need the persistence, you will need the patience, you will need the staying power as somebody who's driving this process. So finding ways to build your resilience, but also to look after yourself. What networks, what support structures can you have that can cushion you and help you to champion the change in the organization and stick with it? Very important. Influence. Creating and nurturing relationships, allies across the business that will support you across the organization is part of being able to sustain lasting change. We need vision. We need visionary leaders at different levels of the organization, people who understand the issues, are able to speak clearly to it, are able to champion it, and are able to step out and say, I stand by what we are trying to do when the challenge does come. Really, really important. And those people then can form a support group that then allows that agenda to be sustained throughout. Communication. Communication and humor is something that I have found really important for people who are working in this space. Sometimes you just need to allow yourself to laugh. Listening to people without needing to challenge them all the time, learning to handle conflict, knowing what are the important conversations to be had, and sometimes making them lighthearted so you can move on from them and they're not too damaging for you. Learning and curiosity. Being open to learn from your experiences, from your mistakes, because you will make mistakes. The moment you start speaking about diversity and inclusion, the moment you can find that you're saying weird things. And therefore, being open to learn from your mistakes and not be damaged by them is so important. So an open mind to learn, thought leadership, equipping yourself with the latest research, the latest thinking and attending events or just equipping yourself is very important. Curiosity is also part of that learning, is asking great questions that leave the conversation open. There will be times when people want to shut the conversation. The act of asking good questions is a really key competency for those who want to build lasting progress with diversity and inclusion. So think about when someone is trying to ask you a question that means they're going to say, okay, then we can't do it. How do you then ask the question that allows them not to say that allows them to leave that conversation open is a really important skill. And then support. Making sure, and I've talked about this, making sure that you have a support system inside and outside the workplace, within the industry, people who understand how this works, people who understand the journey, people who will challenge you, but also support you in your learning within your organization, who give you direct and clear feedback on how things are going is really important. These are just a few. This is not everything you need, but these are some of the things that I find really helpful. And with that, I think we are ready to take on more questions if there are.
Brilliant. Thanks, Margaret. Yes, we do. We've got quite a few questions. So first question coming up here from Benjamin is, how do we create a committee? So what are the first steps to create a committee in-house?
Great. How do we create a committee? This is the first thing, if you haven't got a committee yet, is going to be based on the insights that you have. So what insight, what problem are you trying to solve, or what conversation are you trying to have? That then, those insights, what are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to address? Allows you, what does this mean to us? Will allow you to know, who might I tap on the shoulder, for example, and say, I am thinking about this. These are the insights that I have got. Who else can we bring? Are you on board? Who else can we go to? So you can start quite one-to-one with some people you know, or some people you think might be interested in the subject, and then expanding that network through that immediate circle. Think about who might be interested in this. Who does this impact? Are they interested? If they're not interested, why? Because you might approach somebody and they might be like, I don't want to be involved. That tells you there's almost a culture of fear. There is no safety. So then you've got an insight there. How can I create safety around this issue? That might require some training. So insights are very important. The insights that you have in your first stage will allow you to know who to invite to the table to help you. You first start with a few people and then you ask them, who else do we need to involve? And that way you can, and then how do we want to organize ourselves as small committees around certain issues? Let it be led by the people. That way it doesn't all fall on your shoulders.
Brilliant. And I think a question here, I think this next question kind of leads on to this, and it's from Bethany, and it says, what is a good way to collect insight data, especially if our HR data is limited, how can that inspire all our colleagues to take part?
It's a very common question, because one of the things we find is when we tell people to start with data, they will say we don't have data, or our employees don't disclose their demographics, for example. Now, what does that tell you? This is why you probably do, if you don't have that expertise in-house, you need it from an external provider, because every piece of information that you collect is telling you something about your organization. So, for example, if people are not disclosing the data and that's why you don't have it, what does that mean? That means, again, it goes back to that safety piece, that if you're not a diverse and inclusive organization, then minority groups feel that if they disclose their characteristics, you might use that information badly and penalize them for things. It might put them at a disadvantage. Now, if that is the insight, then the motivation around that is you coming out openly to develop that case, saying, we have noticed, for example, that in this organization, people do not feel safe enough to disclose who they are. If we can't disclose who we are, then we can't address the issues that are important to you and are in turn important to us. Therefore, we are inviting you to come and speak to us. Something about listening sessions, again, those lived experiences. Then going through that and genuinely asking your employees to be able to disclose that data so you can start your journey of change. It takes honesty and vulnerability, and also the integrity that if you ask people to do these things, you will stand by your choices. So when you don't have data, first of all, so there's something about getting data from the employees, and then also there's something about HR not collecting data at all. Now, that is something that HR can control, is asking yourself, what types of data would be important to us to explore or answer the questions that we have. For example, is it employee surveys, for example? Do we have any engagement, well-being, or other demographic surveys that we carry out as an organization? Inside each and every one of those surveys, there is information that you can use. Now, the problem is that most organizations collect that kind of data, but it's not divided, it's not analyzed by characteristics. Now, that's the other thing. So this is where I'm saying the piece around asking your people, telling your people really that you have noticed something is wrong and asking for their help to be a part. This is why that motivation piece is really important, because again, now you see, we want to bring all the employees on the journey. We want them to disclose who they are so we can start to address the issues that are impacting them. So look to HR, think about why are we not collecting this data and how can we do it? That might just be a practical thing that we put out a survey, for example. If the fear is that nobody will answer the survey, then you know that is a fear issue and a safety issue that you now need to address as a business. There's something in your culture that makes people fearful about speaking out or saying their mind. You need to come out and say, our insights show that as a workplace, we are not very good at letting people say what they think, and we want to improve. And we need your help. Employees like when you say that, you can try it and see if people won't come out and start speaking to you. And sometimes you can't do it in-house, and sometimes you have to bring an external provider because people say, I want to speak. I spoke to somebody this week who's they did exactly the same thing. The employees then say, we want to speak, but we won't speak to you. So then I said to them, exactly, because you're not a safe pair of ears. You bring in an external provider that allows those employees to speak. When that information has been given and you handle the process well and nobody gets punished, the next round, the employees will be able to talk to you because then you've earned your place as a safe pair of ears. Again, this is what we are talking about. Knowing where you need to start is really important.
Brilliant. Okay, we've had quite a lot of questions come through, and I wish we had time to sit and answer them all, but I think we've probably only got time for one more question. And this one has come through, and this is actually a common question that's come up a few times. And it's probably a good question to end on and to wrap up. And it says, if you're a business trying to increase your diversity and inclusion, what would you recommend be the first steps if we've done nothing at all?
Okay. As I said, as far as I'm concerned, from my experience, I would say the first step is always insight. Look at what are we trying to achieve? What is the problem right now? Get some insight and then go through that. It's exactly the same thing. Get some insight. What's happening right now? What is our reality? What is causing this reality? What is our aspiration? Build the motivation around that so you can go to your people and communicate this across the business. Build your actions as you go along. Exactly the same process that I have been trying to describe. And you can do this no matter where you're starting. You're going to need some insights to be able to start.
Brilliant. Well, Margaret, thank you so much for being our speaker on today's webinar.
Thank you.
I think this has been an amazing webinar. It's been so insightful, and I think a lot of companies, including ourselves, can take a lot of things from today's session. This is being recorded, so after the session, we will be emailing a video recorded version of this, and we'll also include the slides because we appreciate Margaret has gone into a lot of depth, especially with kind of the roadmap, and it's quite a lot of information to take in. So we will be emailing this around to everybody. So the last thing to say is thank you for every single person that has joined in and listened to today's webinar. We are going to be doing a lot more webinars in the future regarding HR, diversity, recruitment. So do please keep an eye on for all of those. Once again, Margaret, thank you very much for being on today's webinar.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So yeah, like I said, we'll be sending around an email with the webinar link to the video and for the slides that everyone can see. So we hope everyone's have enjoyed the rest of their week, and we'll see you all very, very soon. Thank you.